Today I'm joined on a webinar with attorney Kevin Fine, who has been practicing law here in Arizona for quite some time. I'll let you tell us a little bit more detail about yourself, but you are a personal injury and accident attorney here in Arizona, and we've discussed previously a little bit about insurance, and I've seen you post some things on social media that intrigued me. And I have always joked that when I try to get somebody to buy insurance, that sometimes they don't listen to me, but they come back years later and say, hey, my attorney told me I need to buy this particular policy from you. And so I joke with you that sometimes attorneys are better at selling insurance than insurance agents are. So I appreciate you joining me on this webinar. And if you could just give us a little bit of background about yourself.
You bet. First off, Kent, it's great to speak with you. We've known each other for quite a few years. You have a beautiful family and beautiful kids, and we miss seeing you more regularly than we did, but when we lived in the same neighborhood and same area.
Oh, you.
But I'm a native Arizonan. I was born in Phoenix, grew up in Mesa in my elementary school years. My family packed up and moved to Tucson in my teens, where my father went back to school to get his PhD in electrical engineering, and he's off and on mostly taught at U of A since then. When I graduated and started undergrad and then went to law school, I went up to Brigham Young University, and I wanted to get out of the state instead of staying local and going to U of A. But I came back after graduation, at that time married and with 3 kids when I graduated, and had a couple since then. So my wife and I have raised our 5 children right here in the Phoenix metro area. I graduated in '93, so I started practicing law here in Arizona, shortly thereafter, and I've been doing it ever since. Currently, I'm with Davis Miles McGuire Gardner. That law firm is currently located on Tempe Town Lake, although I haven't seen it in a number of weeks. I think it's still there, but like with a lot of us, we have been hunkered down during this social distancing, that exercise that we've been going through as a nation and world. And hence the reason that we are doing this by video rather than in person. I started, my first job as an attorney was a brief time with the city prosecutor's office down in Tucson. And shortly thereafter, I was hired at a firm here in the Phoenix metro area that did personal injury work, and I've been doing that ever since. So I have approximately 26 years doing personal injury, particularly in the realm of auto accidents. And as a result of that, I've learned a lot about auto insurance as well as auto claims.
Right. So I know a few attorneys that are personal injury attorneys, but I don't usually see them posting about insurance in particular on social media. So I've seen you do that a number of times, which really intrigued me. You seemed like you had more of an interest than other attorneys in the insurance piece of it. What would you say about that? Like, why do you have, and obviously it's part of your job to work with insurance companies and get settlements and everything, but your advice to your clients when it comes to their insurance and things like that, you seem to have more of an interest in that piece.
Well, I think that it's, first off, I think it needs to be said that in the realm of auto injuries and auto injury claims, there's a lot of suffering out there that people don't really think about until they're going through it themselves. And good auto insurance is the best way to help alleviate the suffering of another person if we have caused it, and also to protect our family and help alleviate the suffering that maybe our family is going through if someone else has caused an injury to us or one of our loved ones. And so because of that, over the years, I've continued to gain an appreciation for the importance of good auto insurance in this whole mix. Also, as an attorney, I see how the auto insurance actually is used when it needs to be used. Most of us as consumers of insurance are shopping, so maybe we're price sensitive and looking at what does the company offer and what are the minimums I have to carry, and we may not really understand much of what's even in our policy. And as an attorney that is helping educate people in what those different parts of their policy actually mean and what they do, I'm talking to them basically when it's too late to do anything about it. And a lot of times people have not adequately insured themselves against the harm that others can cause, as well as the harm they may have caused someone. And by the time I see it in front of me, I can explain to them exactly what it is and what it does and how much they have. But it's too late for them at that point in time to do anything about it. When a good agent is meeting with someone, they're at the front end of that when they can do something about it. And so I like to help the public understand what this insurance really is and what it does in real time, back when they're meeting with somebody like you and can still do something about it. So I've posted some videos and done some articles along those lines.
That's great. And hopefully this video will be a little bit proactive and we can reach a few people who really kind of care about their insurance and want to make sure that they're protected well. Now, speaking of that, the law has recently changed here in Arizona to increase the minimum liability limits that a person who's registered and driving a vehicle must carry here in Arizona. We went from 153010 and that was increased to 2550. I'd like your thoughts on that. Do you feel like that was sufficient, or do you feel like it should have been more? And then we can bridge over into what is a reasonable amount of insurance. If you feel like that's still too low, what should somebody carry? I know what we advise is 100 and 300, or a lot of times we'll say you should get as much insurance as you can afford, or even better, as much as the insurance company will give you, because there's no better way to transfer risk from yourself to another entity like an insurance company than through insurance. That's the best tool and method that we have to do that. So your thoughts on Arizona increasing the minimum limits to 2550? Did they go far enough with that?
Right. Well, first off, let me say, as a personal injury attorney who is helping people make claims, often against an insurance policy, I will first clarify that everything that you just said is, in my opinion, perfectly accurate and good advice. The 100-300 standard that you mentioned, I think, is great advice, or as much as you can afford to carry, great advice. And finally, on the recent increase in coverage, let me touch on that. Probably about every other or every third year, there is a proposal to increase the minimum required rate of insurance here in Arizona. Let me talk about what that means. Before this change, which takes effect in July, before this change, the minimum coverage required by law in Arizona was what we call a 153010 policy. And what that means is that the maximum the insurance company would pay out if a claim were made due to the fault of one of their insureds is $15,000 on any individual claim, and capped at $30,000 per incident. Meaning if there were 1, 3, or 10 people with claims under a particular accident, it would still top out at $30,000 total. So $15,000 per person, $30,000 total, and the 10 means $10,000 toward property damage. No matter what property damage was actually done, it stops at $10,000. The legislature has, well, that first off, it needs to be clarified that those standards were set in, it was the 1970s, I believe, 1973. And it has not changed since then for a couple of reasons. The main one is simply that the legislature was frankly reluctant to set a mandatory insurance purchase policy in the first place. Telling people how to spend some of the money that wasn't already taken by the government in taxes was a hard pill for the legislature to swallow even in the 70s. But they did it because there are certain public benefits, certain needs that needed to be balanced against that. They've continued to be reluctant ever since then to increase the rates for the same reason. There was finally an increase passed through last year that takes place this summer. It moves it from $15,000 to $25,000, which makes it, instead of a 153010, we're going to have a 25, 50, 25. Now, is that enough of an increase? First off, it's good that there was an increase. It means that there's that much more coverage available if somebody were to injure you or a family member. And that much more protection that the average person has on their policy if they have coverage at all, which they're supposed to. Was it enough? Well, if you want to take inflation into account, it looks pretty meager, because I love using the Big Mac, what they call the Big Mac inflation index, and that is, look at the price of a Big Mac back in the day when a certain financial event took place, compare it to the price of the Big Mac now. That number is 6 times right now greater than in the 1970s when this was first passed. In other words, if you were to actually just simply adjust for inflation, then the minimum policy should be about 90,000. Okay, so instead of, if this same law were passed in 1973 and put at the equivalent of $15,000 then the minimum policy would be closer to the $100,000 mark, which means that a $100,000 policy would be closer to $500,000, right? So was it enough? Well, that's for an individual to decide. But if you adjust for inflation, then if you want to have the same coverage now as the minimum policy was back in the 70s, you would carry at least $100,000. If you want to have the equivalent of the $100,000 policy, you're carrying something closer to $500,000. And so, long answer, but from that standpoint, you need to protect yourself better than the minimum coverage in most circumstances. You can think of how quickly, $25,000 can disappear if somebody is injured in a hospital for any length of time.
Yeah, and I love that analogy. That makes a lot of sense to me, that we haven't changed the limits for so long, and if you were to adjust for inflation, that it should be a lot higher. And you were explaining to me the other day in a conversation we had about scenarios where accidents that you've seen where there were 6 claimants against one policyholder. Maybe you could run through a claim scenario like that, where it's not just you hit a car and maybe there's one person coming after your insurance, but there could be multiple claimants from that one accident coming after your insurance. And if you don't have enough, what happens? I mean, what's your experience in that scenario?
I can go into a little detail without naming names, because this is a matter of public record right now, but I am currently representing a family in a wrongful death case where there is very little insurance coverage on behalf of the person who caused the accident. A mother and a child were both killed in the accident, and there are 8 claimants against that wrongful death claim. So in that one case, there are 8 people claiming against one small policy for the death of a mother, wife, and also a child or sibling. So and that's you can see how quickly in a situation like that, the inadequate insurance really hurts the family. And we're going to talk probably in a moment about ways that you can better protect yourself. But I also put myself in the shoes of the person who causes a tragedy like that. This person did not mean to harm anyone. He just made a mistake while driving. He should have been paying better attention. He wasn't. That can happen to any of us. Did to him, and the result of that action was severe. And so there can be, and if somebody causes an accident and there are multiple people in the other car who sustain injuries, then there can be multiple claimants against that coverage. And we may also talk a little bit about what happens if a person is not adequately covered and there is a substantial claim against that person. That's an important thing to consider as well.
So with the new increase, as you mentioned, 25, 50, 50,000 would represent the total amount that the policy would be willing to pay for bodily injury for any one claim or event or accident. And if you consider 8 people coming after that same pot of $50,000, it seems woefully inadequate when you put it in that context, that 50,000 spread across 8 people is nothing, especially Like you said, when there's a death involved or a hospital stay or anything like that, it seems woefully underinsured at that point.
Absolutely. And, with the cost of medical expenses now, which even the most conservative juror or person would probably want to at least pay the medical expenses associated with a loss. And so if somebody sustains a severe injury, and even paying the medical expenses back can be, considerably above those types of coverages, even the higher coverages, which is why we say, at least carry a good solid 100, 300, if not umbrella coverage and other measures to have additional coverage. I've personally handled cases where the medical expenses were above 300,000. And I've heard of a case handled by actually one of our partners at the firm who, and I did not know if this was even a possibility, but the entire medical expenses on this particular gentleman who was injured are above $10 million right now. And medical expenses can really get up there, even if you're not considering the non-economic consequences or even income loss that may be created from an auto accident.
Right. There's a lot that goes into that. If somebody's crippled and it changes their lifestyle, like you said, their income, there's a lot that a driver can be held liable for. So when we start looking at ways to really protect ourselves, increasing our limits on our auto policy or our homeowner's policy is one way, but you just mentioned another piece that we can add, which is the excess liability, or sometimes called the umbrella. I think when people, sometimes they hear this phrase, full coverage auto insurance, and it gives the wrong impression or image that somebody's covered for everything or up to whatever maximum amount of lawsuit that they might have come against them, which is just not true. Whatever your policy limits say, once that policy pays that, that's the end of it. You don't have any more insurance coverage, even though you thought you had full coverage, and you may be held liable for the excess expenses that people incur from an accident that you caused. So one of the ways that we like to make sure there's extra protection is by adding an umbrella. And I know that you're a big advocate of that as well, if you'd like to touch on that.
Umbrella coverage is available through a homeowner's policy, and it is a way to get additional coverage above the solid amount that a person should be carrying on their auto policy. There's usually a cap on how high that can go, and then you go to an umbrella policy to get additional protection. A lot of people never even ask about umbrella coverage because it sounds like it would be really expensive to get that additional coverage, and it just isn't. The premiums charged on that umbrella coverage are surprisingly affordable for how much more protection you get. It's just worth exploring with a good agent.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. We see that you can add, in some cases, an additional $1 million of protection for, $20 a month, maybe. Depending on the number of cars and the number of drivers, of course, could be more expensive, but still relatively affordable in the grand scheme of understanding that you're taking $1 million of risk and transferring it to the insurance company for quite a small premium, really. So,
yeah, and it doesn't take much, like we've been talking about. It doesn't take much of an injury. Let me put it this way. It's probably better put that I regularly see injury claims that go into those realms. Maybe not $1 million, but certainly above even a really good high auto insurance policy, just because of medical bills and lost income. And if somebody sustains a serious injury, they're almost immediately going to be into those higher ranges. So it's not unheard of. The chances of somebody causing an accident that creates losses in those ranges is surprisingly high.
Yeah. What kind of, just to try to touch on this a little bit more, if somebody doesn't have enough coverage and they're in an accident, the financial strain that could put on them as an individual or their family, while they're going through the claims process and realizing that there's probably not going to be enough coverage to meet the need. What happens from there? You hear a lot of chatter about garnished wages or about what can happen to somebody if they don't have enough coverage. Have you experienced that in your practice?
Yeah, well, it's easier to probably talk about what can happen rather than what will happen, right? So let me talk just law of what can happen. Even if a person has insurance, even if a person has quite a bit of insurance, the claim and the lawsuit is actually against the individual who caused the accident, right? So the claimant does not have to accept the coverage limits. That's all the insurance company has to pay. It's all they have to offer. But the claimant does not have to accept it. They can instead choose to go to court and put it in front of a jury and get a judgment against that driver. And if that happens, the insurance company is not named as a party. It's the at-fault driver. So with that judgment in hand, the claimant or claimants, as we've discussed, can then start to collect against personal assets. And those personal assets can be equity in a home above a certain limit. They can be 401ks and pension plans. They can be, money in checking accounts. It can be garnished wages. So there are lots of ways that an excess judgment. Now, if somebody goes and gets that judgment and it is in excess of what the insurance coverage is, all the insurance company has to do is pay whatever their limit was. They don't have to pay that excess. So that excess judgment, the amount above the insurance coverage, is a personal obligation at that point, which the claimants can collect legally through a number of means. Is that what a claimant would choose to do? I can't make that judgment call. I can't say that it would or wouldn't happen in any particular situation, but the law certainly allows it. And so without adequate coverage, a person is at least vulnerable to that scenario.
I don't know about you, but that would make me lose sleep at night. And I suppose as you get along in life and maybe you've built up some assets, whether it's stocks or cash or whatever assets you may have, that you really want to start looking for the ways that you can protect that. And some people try to do creative things with, I'm going to keep things in certain LLCs so that it's protected. But really, for, like we just talked about, not a whole lot of money, you can get another $1 million of insurance coverage. And really, that goes a long way to protecting the assets that you have. And obviously, we can increase the umbrella. We've seen umbrellas up to $10 million for people who have significant wealth and assets.
Yeah.
But what a great way to protect yourself.
Well, it's probably the best way, frankly. The proper estate planning, of course, is a tool, and it's an important one, especially for people who start to amass some wealth that they would like to protect. But part of that whole equation is going to be healthy amounts of liability insurance. We haven't talked about uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage yet, but certainly to protect those assets, even the estate planners are going to say that insurance piece is essential.
Yeah, and I think part of that problem is that insurance companies themselves have done a really good job of making people think that price is all that matters when it comes to their insurance, because most of the insurance commercials talk about saving money. Just save money, call in, you can save money. Even as brokers, I'll admit that sometimes we get focused on saving people money because we think that's what's going to attract them to buy insurance from us. But really, in Arizona especially, there's a higher standard of care that we should have in giving solid advice to our clients on what amounts of insurance they should cover to protect themselves. So I appreciate you joining me to talk about that and hopefully setting a precedence for people. And I'm surprised that they don't understand more about what their exposures are and how quickly their limits can really be chewed up in a claim, especially like when there are multiple claimants. Now, the other piece of insurance that I know you always like to discuss is the under and uninsured motorist coverage and kind of what that does. I had a question just the other day from an agent here in our agency who was talking with a client, and their argument was, well, if I have good health insurance, why do I need the under and uninsured motorist piece? Can't I just cancel that and save money? And again, it'd be a very small amount of money that they would save, but that's still how a lot of consumers' mindsets are. I'd like to try to change that. So what is your input as an attorney on carrying under and uninsured motorists? And do you have any statistics or information about how many drivers in Arizona are uninsured or underinsured? I think it's a pretty large number, but I'm wondering if you have any information on that.
Well, yeah, the first number is approximately 20% of the drivers on the roads in Arizona are carrying no insurance at all. and of course, those are estimates. Nobody knows for sure, but the best statistics out there put it at 18-20% range. In addition to that, it's harder to gauge what to call somebody who is underinsured, because once they have insurance, it's a little bit of, eye of the beholder as to what the value or what the proper compensation should have been for a loss, right? For harms and losses sustained. But if you look at the number of claims that the insurance companies themselves are just looking at and saying, look, there's just woefully inadequate amounts of insurance available, here we're offering it. If you look at that, and the insurance companies themselves would even recognize the value of this claim is above our policy limit, then it's a good 20-25% in addition to that. So 40 to 45% of the time, let's put it in these terms. If a person or a family is injured due to the wrongdoing of another driver, the chances of that other driver either being uninsured or underinsured for the harms that they've caused is 40-45%. And so the chances of being harmed by someone who's in one of those two categories is pretty high. So, of course, what does a person do about it, right? And there's the uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage discussion.
So let's talk about what the under and uninsured motorist actually protects. I mean, as the name implies, it will help us in scenarios where the other driver who may have caused an accident doesn't have enough insurance. But what kinds of things does it cover? What does it really do for us? And in relationship to the question that this potential insured asked, if I have good health insurance, why do I need? My health insurance will just pay my medical bills. Why do I still need the under and uninsured motorist?
Right. Well, and this is one of these things that is hard for a person to really understand until they've gone through it or until they've seen someone else go through it. And that is, in addition to medical expenses, there are two other major categories in most claims that we as society recognize and feel. One is lost income. Health insurance plan doesn't pay that, right? And so if a person has a substantial past, present, and even future loss of income, which can happen easily, that's not included in that, right? For example, I have a gentleman whose case resolved recently he's a truck driver. He's been a truck driver since he was 18 years old. He was in his 40s when this happened. He was lucky to live, but one of the things that happened to him in this accident was a severe shoulder injury, which makes it so he can't drive a truck. There are other, and he's not very well trained for any other kinds of line of work except physical activities, which he can't do. So his loss of income is ongoing. He can work, but he can't make the same amount of money he was before. He's taken a loss for the rest of his career. You start calculating those kinds of numbers and say, well, gosh, a health insurance plan isn't going to do anything for that part of it. And the third is this, what we call non-economic damages or human losses. And that is a person who's going through something like this says, well, if great, my doctors got paid, but they didn't go through this. I did. What about the loss of sleep and the loss of activities? And I couldn't join my family on the vacation to California. And the fact that I'm in constant pain now. And what about the human losses that the person is experiencing? Well, a healthcare plan doesn't pay any of that either. And that's all part of the claim. And so there are, of the three major categories of a claim, a healthcare plan only takes care of the first category, and a person going through this will recognize not only is it just one of the three categories, it's probably the least important to the person going through the experience, either themselves or watching a family member suffer through it or a loved one. So that's the first point. And so if you want to look at being able to protect yourself against that kind of a loss caused by someone who has no insurance or inadequate insurance, that's where uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage comes in. And I ask every client of mine who comes in, or person I'm visiting with, it's one of the first questions I ask is, do you have uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage? Because often early on, we don't have any idea either whether the at-fault person has insurance or how much, right? Something we don't know right away. So I'll ask that question. And the most common answer I get is, what is that? So it is an important coverage and probably one of the least understood. First point about uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage is it's not required by law. So if a person says, I have full coverage, they may or may not have it. And the second is just the definitions. Uninsured motorist coverage acts like the insurance on the at-fault driver if the at-fault driver has no insurance. That's what it means by uninsured motorist. Underinsured motorist coverage kicks in and acts like additional coverage on the policy of the at-fault driver if they have insurance but not enough, all right, which is likely. So that's what underinsured, because that driver is underinsured. So it's your own coverage that comes in and acts like additional coverage on behalf of the person who caused the accident and injury to you, which seems a little odd. And people say, well, I don't want to use that. It'll make my own insurance rates go up. That is not true. By law, they cannot raise your rates or cancel your policy or affect your policy in any way for using uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage. And by law, an accident has to be more than 50% of a person's fault before they can take that into consideration at all. So you can use that coverage without increasing your rates, but it gives you, it's a way that a person can, ahead of time, protect themselves and their family from the scenario where an uninsured or underinsured motorist is the one who causes harm to them. And so, again, same as we talked about earlier, best coverage you can afford on that front is what you need to do. Up and including if you can add it to an umbrella policy, but at least adequate amounts on the auto policy can give you some peace of mind. And I'll tell you that almost every time that coverage is available in my cases, we end up needing to use it because there are so many drivers who are uninsured or underinsured.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. You mentioned before that sometimes you're dealing with insurance when there's nothing that you can do about it at that point because the accident has already happened. I had a client years ago who came in, and she had previously been in a really severe auto accident that was not her fault, but the other driver did not have enough insurance. I mean, her medical bills were in the hundreds of thousands, and not to mention the lost wages and all that. So when she came to buy insurance for me, she just moved to Arizona and was buying a new policy for me in Arizona. And she actually said to me, I want the highest limits of under and uninsured motorist protection that I can get, because she had been through the experience and realized how valuable that coverage really is because it protects you and your family and that sort of thing. The insurance policy, that's one of the very few things in the application where there is a specific sign off for that coverage. If you are not purchasing at least to the same limits of your liability, or you decide not to purchase that coverage at all, there is a separate initial and sign off form for that. That's how important I think the insurance company also views that coverage, because they do have their own sign off section in the application for under and uninsured motorist coverage, and so many people don't understand it or what it covers. So again, as an example, right now minimum limits are $15,000. If somebody runs into you and causes an accident and your bills are $100,000 and they only have $15,000 of coverage, if you have the proper limits of underinsured motorists, you can go to your own policy to get those additional limits out of it.
Yes, and that coverage is so, even people who are carrying it often don't know they have it, and a lot of people don't carry it, but that coverage is important enough that there was a time here in Arizona that it was required coverage. There was a time that it wasn't, and then there was a time period where the legislature actually made it mandatory because it's so important. Then they backed off of that, but still require agents to offer it so people are aware of it. But still, even with all of that, people still don't really understand what it is. I get that. this isn't what they're doing for a living. I've been, and so they, but if anybody watches this video or reads anything I've written, make sure that you visit with your agent about uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage. Make sure it's on your policy and make sure it's healthy.
Yeah. I've had a few clients where they feel like they want to decline that coverage. They're willing to protect, the liability is protecting others, and the comprehensive and collision is protecting your car, but the UM/UIM is what's really protecting you. And I always scratch my head when I'm saying, you want to protect other people with liability, protect your car with comp and collision, but you don't want to protect yourself with UM/UIM coverage. I don't understand that. So
Right.
hopefully this maybe educates a few people.
Right.
I'd like to revisit something you talked about earlier about the moral obligation. Of course, we want to protect ourselves, make sure that we're adequately covered for things that might happen. But I also like the other side of that equation where you talk about the moral obligation that most of us hopefully feel if we were to hurt somebody else in an accident. And could you walk us through a scenario where you've seen somebody that had plenty of coverage and the other family was well taken care of, and how that played out?
Yes. Yeah. Along those lines, it seems that there are we usually think of two categories, but there are really three categories in my mind of reasons to carry adequate insurance. One is to protect our own assets against a claim if we create harm to someone else, right? It's a personal protection thing in a way, and that's still a bit of a selfish motive. It's to protect me. I'm going to carry adequate liability insurance in case I harm someone, so that I don't have my assets exposed. Good, valid reason. The second is in the realm of uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage, is to carry enough insurance to protect me and my family if someone else causes us harm and doesn't have the wherewithal through insurance to compensate properly for the claim. So again, that's kind of me looking or my own looking, and that's fine, perfectly legitimate. And we all start there. I think there's a third category, and that is just the moral obligation to be in a position to adequately help someone else if we cause them harm. And even if a person doesn't have a lot of assets or doesn't believe that their assets would ever be collected if they caused harm, if somebody does cause substantial harm to another human being, most of us feel bad about that and want to help to the degree that we can. Well, insurance coverage is the best way to do that as well. I had a situation, where there was it was a truck driver. This case is resolved, so I can talk a little bit about it. But there was a truck driver who took stopped at a light, had fully stopped at a light, was looking, as many of us do, was looking to their left to check for traffic. It was at a red light, but was allowed to go once traffic cleared, and didn't realize that a gentleman had entered the sidewalk or the crosswalk in front of his truck to cross on his green light for walking. And so the truck goes as the gentleman was in front of him, and you can imagine the consequences were not good. That did kill the gentleman who was in the crosswalk. I had, while that case was proceeding, that truck driver gentleman was so distraught about the loss that he had caused that his attorney kept telling me, this gentleman wants you to make sure that the family understands how bad he feels about this. It's completely separate from compensation or the claim or whatever. He just felt really, really bad about this harm that he had caused. Took him a while to be able to get behind the wheel. And the people I represented were dear people and kept communicating back to tell this driver to let it go. It's all right. We understand things happen. He didn't mean to do this. But in that circumstance, luckily for the family, there was a commercial policy because it was a professional truck. I share that story because it has a positive ending on both sides, but in the sense that there was adequate insurance. But I just recently heard from the agent handling the claim with these 8 claimants against the one small policy for the loss of the mother and child, same situation. This young man is just distraught over the loss that he has caused. He doesn't have a lot of assets, doesn't, nothing to really collect. And so the insurance is going to be enough. And I don't know, but I assume that that young man would rather there be more available for these family members. So there's a moral obligation. That was a long way of saying, I think that there's a moral obligation that gives us some peace of mind too, if we were to be the ones causing the harm. And we never intend to. I've never had a client that thought they were going to be involved in an auto accident when they got up in that morning, or that they thought a family member would be taken from them that day. Never had that. 26 plus years. Never had somebody say, yeah, I knew that it would happen the day that it happened, or the moment before it happened, even. So you don't know. And the same with I'm sure it's the same with the people who caused the accidents. They didn't know that that was going to happen ever, and probably assumed it never would. Yet there it is, and the ramifications of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece to understand. And I think most of us as good citizens and as human beings can, when we think of it like that, can relate to that. If I was to injure somebody and either cripple them, heaven forbid, cripple them or whatever, or take a father away from his family or whatever, I would want to be able to give them as much monetary, you can never make up for the loss, but at least you can take care of their monetary needs with your insurance. Right. So the more you have in that scenario, the better. So I think that gives people something to really think about and chew on. So, well, Kevin, I really appreciate you joining me today. Hopefully we've educated or given some things for people to think about. Is there any closing things that you feel like consumers should know and think about when they're looking at their insurance, either buying a policy or sitting down with their agent to do a review?
Yeah, just in closing, I think that the average person out on the roads underestimates the chances of something like this happening, either of their being harmed by another driver or causing harm. And adequate insurance is the most direct and in least expensive way to prepare for that moment in time. And I don't sell insurance. I don't make any premium on this, but for any kind of sale of insurance. But so I can say objectively that it needs to be taken very seriously, and spend some time understanding the policy and working with an agent to make sure that you have the best coverage you can have.
Yeah. And so, like you said, we can't do it after the fact. It's, we can't put homeowners insurance, or we can't increase the limits on homeowners insurance when it's on fire. It's too late. So the time to do something about it is before the accident or before the claim happens. So if anybody has any doubts about their limits or what their policy limits are or what they cover, what they mean, hopefully they'll reach out and get those questions answered. So thanks again for joining me today, and hopefully we've shed a little bit of light on the subject for people who may watch this video.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, Kevin, have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.